The morning sun cast long shadows across the training facility as Captain Sarah Martinez walked onto the obstacle course. At 32, she had earned her position through years of dedication and countless hours proving herself in a male-dominated field. Her black hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and her uniform bore the insignia that commanded respect from everyone under her command. The SEAL training program was in full swing, with candidates pushing their bodies to the absolute limit. These were America's elite warriors in training, men who had already passed through some of the toughest selection processes in the military. Yet today, one of them would learn a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Petty Officer Jake Stevens was 26 years old and built like a tank. He had grown up in Texas, where traditional gender roles were deeply ingrained in his thinking. He had never served under a female officer before, and the idea didn't sit well with him. His broad shoulders and confident swagger made him popular among his fellow trainees, but his attitude toward authority figures who didn't fit his worldview was about to get him into serious trouble. As Captain Martinez approached the group of sweating, exhausted SEALs, she noticed the way Stevens looked at her. It wasn't the respectful attention she received from most of her subordinates. Instead, there was something dismissive in his eyes, something that suggested he didn't take her seriously as a commanding officer. The training exercise for the day was a complex navigation drill that would test both physical endurance and mental sharpness. The candidates would need to carry heavy packs across difficult terrain while following precise coordinates. It was the kind of challenge that separated the truly elite from those who merely thought they were tough enough. Captain Martinez began explaining the exercise parameters when she noticed Stevens whispering to the man next to him. The other trainee looked uncomfortable, but Stevens seemed amused by whatever he was saying. She continued with her briefing, making note of the disruption but choosing to address it through proper channels rather than calling him out in front of the group. The disrespect was subtle but unmistakable. Stevens would look away when she was speaking directly to the group, roll his eyes when she gave instructions, and generally behave as though her authority was somehow negotiable. His fellow trainees began to notice the tension building, and some started to distance themselves from Stevens, recognizing that his behavior was heading toward a dangerous confrontation. When Captain Martinez finished her briefing and asked if there were any questions, Stevens raised his hand with a smirk that made her stomach tighten. She had seen that look before on the faces of men who thought they could intimidate her or make her look foolish in front of others. It was a look that said he believed her position was unearned, that she was somehow less qualified to lead simply because she was a woman. The question he asked was technically appropriate, but the tone was mocking and dismissive. He wanted to know if she had ever actually completed the course she was asking them to run. The implication was clear. How could she possibly understand what they were going through if she hadn't experienced it herself? The other trainees shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the challenge embedded in what should have been a simple inquiry. Captain Martinez felt her jaw clench slightly, but her voice remained steady and professional as she answered. Yes, she had completed the course multiple times during her own training and certification processes. She had earned every qualification necessary to train and evaluate SEAL candidates. Her response was factual and calm, but Stevens wasn't finished with his little performance. As the group prepared to begin the exercise, Stevens made a comment just loud enough for several people to hear. He suggested that maybe they should take it easy since their instructor probably couldn't keep up with real warriors. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Captain Martinez knew that her response would determine not just Stevens's fate, but also her credibility with the entire group. She had faced similar situations before, but never with quite this level of public disrespect from a trainee. The military hierarchy was built on mutual respect and clear lines of authority, and Stevens was deliberately undermining both. His behavior wasn't just inappropriate, it was dangerous to unit cohesion and mission effectiveness. The other trainees watched nervously as Captain Martinez approached Stevens. They could see the steel in her eyes, the way her posture straightened with unmistakable authority. This wasn't going to end well for their fellow candidate, and they all knew it. Stevens, however, seemed oblivious to the storm clouds gathering around him. Still basking in what he perceived as a clever challenge to an authority figure he didn't respect, Captain Martinez stopped directly in front of Stevens, her boots planted firmly in the sand. The morning air was thick with tension as she looked up at the larger man who towered over her by nearly a foot. Her voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority when she spoke. "Petty Officer Stevens, I believe you have something you'd like to say to me directly, rather than muttering comments to your teammates." Her words cut through the humid air like a blade, and Stevens suddenly realized that his private joke had become very public very quickly. For a moment, Stevens hesitated. The smirk faded from his face as he looked down at the woman who held his military future in her hands, but his pride and ingrained prejudices pushed him forward, past the point of wisdom, and straight into career-ending territory. "Ma'am, I was just wondering how someone who's never been in real combat can train warriors who might actually face the enemy." The words came out more aggressive than he had intended, and he immediately knew he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The other trainees took an involuntary step backward. They had all heard stories about Captain Martinez's background, her deployments, her commendations. Stevens clearly hadn't done his homework, and his ignorance was about to cost him dearly. Captain Martinez nodded slowly, as if she had expected exactly this kind of challenge. Her expression remained calm, but there was something dangerous flickering behind her eyes. When she spoke, her voice carried across the training ground with crystal clarity. "I see. So you believe that my lack of combat experience makes me unqualified to evaluate your performance." She paused. Letting the words sink in. "Tell me, Stevens, what do you know about my service record?" Stevens shifted uncomfortably. He had made assumptions based on her gender and her current role as an instructor, but he had never actually looked into her background. The confidence that had fueled his disrespect began to evaporate as he realized he might have made a serious error in judgment. "I thought so," Captain Martinez continued when he failed to respond. "Let me educate you, since you clearly haven't taken the time to educate yourself. I have 3 combat deployments under my belt, including 18 months in Afghanistan where I led intelligence operations behind enemy lines. I have a Bronze Star for valor and a Purple Heart from wounds sustained while extracting wounded soldiers under enemy fire." The color drained from Stevens's face as the full weight of his mistake began to dawn on him. Around him, his fellow trainees stared at the ground, embarrassed to be associated with his spectacular failure of judgment and military bearing. Captain Martinez wasn't finished. "I completed SEAL training myself before it was open to women officially, as part of a classified program to develop female special operations capabilities. I have logged more hours in combat zones than most of the instructors on this base, and I have forgotten more about tactical operations than you have ever learned." Stevens opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to apologize or explain, but Captain Martinez held up a hand to silence him. The gesture was small, but it carried such authority that he immediately obeyed, his jaw snapping shut with an audible click. "But here's what troubles me most about your attitude, Stevens. It's not that you questioned my qualifications. Questions are welcome when asked respectfully and with genuine interest in learning. It's that you assumed I was unqualified based on my gender, and you chose to express your ignorance through public disrespect rather than professional inquiry." The training ground had fallen completely silent, except for the sound of wind moving through the nearby trees. Even the instructors from other groups had stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation unfold. "You want to know if I can keep up with real warriors?" Captain Martinez asked, her voice taking on a tone that made several trainees actually step backward. "Then let me propose a simple test. You and I will complete this course together. If you finish ahead of me, I'll recommend you for immediate advancement in the program. If I finish ahead of you, you'll spend the rest of your time here learning about the importance of respect and proper military bearing." Stevens looked around desperately, hoping to find some support or sympathy from his fellow trainees. But they were all studying their boots with intense concentration. He had painted himself into a corner with his big mouth and his small mind, and now he was going to have to face the consequences. "What's wrong, Stevens?" Captain Martinez asked, with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Suddenly not so confident about your abilities compared to someone who's never been in real combat?" The trap was perfectly laid, and Stevens walked right into it. His pride wouldn't let him back down from a challenge issued by a woman, especially not in front of his peers. He straightened his shoulders and nodded, sealing his fate with a gesture that would haunt him for years to come. "Yes, ma'am. I accept your challenge." The words came out steady enough, but there was a tremor in his voice that suggested he was beginning to understand just how badly he had miscalculated the situation. The obstacle course stretched out before them like a nightmare designed by someone who understood exactly how to push the human body beyond its limits. Rope climbs, wall traversals, mud crawls, and carrying stations were arranged in a sequence that would test every muscle group and mental faculty the candidates possessed. Captain Martinez stripped off her outer jacket, revealing the same tactical gear that the trainees wore. Her movements were efficient and purposeful as she checked her equipment and prepared for the challenge ahead. Stevens watched her with growing unease, beginning to notice details he had missed before. The way she moved with the fluid confidence of someone completely comfortable with physical challenges, the scars visible on her forearms that spoke of real combat experience. Word had spread quickly through the base about the confrontation, and small groups of off-duty personnel began gathering at vantage points around the course. This wasn't just a training exercise anymore. It was a public demonstration of respect, authority, and the consequences of challenging both without cause. The course began with a quarter-mile run carrying 60-pound packs, followed immediately by a series of obstacles designed to test upper body strength, coordination, and mental toughness. Stevens had always prided himself on his physical conditioning, and he started the run with confidence, keeping pace with Captain Martinez as they moved across the sandy terrain. For the first few hundred yards, they ran side by side, their breathing steady and controlled. Stevens began to feel better about his chances. Maybe the captain was tough for a woman, but he was bigger, stronger, and younger. How hard could it be to outperform someone who spent most of her time behind a desk? His confidence lasted exactly as long as it took them to reach the first major obstacle, a rope climb that extended 40 feet straight up. Captain Martinez attacked the rope with a technique that was both beautiful and terrifying to watch. Her movements were economical and precise, each motion flowing seamlessly into the next as she practically flew up the rope. Stevens followed, his larger frame making the climb more difficult despite his strength advantage. By the time he reached the top, Captain Martinez was already halfway down, her descent controlled and rapid. She hit the ground with cat-like grace and was moving toward the next obstacle before Stevens had even begun his descent. The next challenge was a wall traverse that required candidates to move horizontally along a 15-foot wall, using only small handholds. It demanded finger strength, core stability, and the kind of mental focus that came from years of training and real-world application. Stevens watched in growing alarm as Captain Martinez moved across the wall like a spider, her technique flawless and her speed incredible. By the time Stevens completed the wall traverse, Captain Martinez had opened up a lead of nearly 50 yards. His lungs were starting to burn, and sweat was pouring down his face despite the relatively cool morning air. The pack on his back felt like it was gaining weight with every step, and his confidence was evaporating faster than morning dew. The mud crawl section was particularly brutal, requiring the candidates to low crawl under barbed wire for 200 yards through knee-deep mud and water. It was designed to break down anyone who wasn't completely committed to completing the course, and it had claimed many would-be SEALs over the years. Captain Martinez entered the mud crawl with the same mechanical precision she had shown on every other obstacle. Her technique minimized energy expenditure while maximizing speed, and she moved through the murky water like she had done it 1,000 times before. Which, Stevens was beginning to realize, she probably had. Stevens plunged into the mud behind her, immediately feeling the cold water soak through his clothes and the thick mud grab at his elbows and knees. The barbed wire above his head seemed designed to catch on everything, and he found himself fighting the course rather than working with it the way Captain Martinez was doing. Halfway through the crawl, Stevens made a critical error. Frustrated by his slower progress and the growing gap between himself and the captain, he tried to move faster than his technique could support. He caught his pack on a piece of wire and had to waste precious time untangling himself, all while watching Captain Martinez emerge from the far end of the obstacle like some kind of military machine. The physical gap between them was now approaching 100 yards, but the psychological gap was even wider. Stevens was beginning to understand that he wasn't just losing a race. He was being systematically dismantled by someone who operated on a completely different level than he had imagined possible. His fellow trainees watched from the sidelines with a mixture of horror and fascination. They had all disliked Stephen's attitude, but watching him get thoroughly outclassed was still uncomfortable to witness. This wasn't just about one man's comeuppance. It was a lesson for all of them about assumptions, respect, and the price of both arrogance and ignorance. As they moved into the final third of the course, Stevens was running on pride and stubbornness alone. His body was failing. His technique was falling apart, and his confidence had been completely shattered. But quitting wasn't an option, not with half the base watching and his military career hanging in the balance. The log carry was the obstacle that finally broke Stevens's spirit. 200 yards of sprinting while carrying a 150-pound log, followed immediately by a tire flip section that would test every muscle fiber in his body. He watched Captain Martinez hoist her log with practiced ease, settling it across her shoulders in a way that distributed the weight efficiently across her frame. Stevens struggled to even get his log positioned properly. The weight seemed impossible, far heavier than anything he had trained with before. His shoulders screamed in protest as he finally managed to get the massive piece of timber settled and began his stumbling run toward the next station. Captain Martinez was moving with the log like it was a natural extension of her body. Her pace never wavered, her breathing remained controlled, and her form stayed perfect, even under the crushing weight. She had done this exact exercise hundreds of times, and her body had adapted to handle loads that would cripple untrained individuals. By the time Stevens reached the tire flip section, his legs were shaking with exhaustion, and his vision was starting to blur around the edges. The massive tires, each weighing over 400 pounds, stood before him like monuments to his own inadequacy. He could barely see Captain Martinez in the distance, already halfway through her set of flips, the heavy tire moving under her control with mechanical precision. Stevens attacked his first tire flip with everything he had left. But his technique was all wrong. Instead of using his legs and core to drive the tire over, he tried to muscle it with his arms and back. The result was predictable. He barely managed to flip the tire once before his strength gave out completely, and he collapsed to his knees in the sand. The watching crowd fell silent as Stevens knelt there, gasping for air and staring at the tire that had defeated him so completely. This wasn't just physical exhaustion. This was the moment when all his assumptions about strength, capability, and gender roles came crashing down around him, in full view of his peers and superiors. Captain Martinez completed her tire flips and moved on to the final obstacle. A 30-foot rope climb, followed by a sprint to the finish line. She paused at the base of the rope and looked back at Stevens, still kneeling beside his tire nearly 200 yards behind her. For a moment, her expression softened slightly, and those watching thought she might wait for him or offer some form of encouragement. Instead, she simply turned and attacked the rope with the same devastating efficiency she had shown throughout the entire course. Her ascent was flawless, her descent controlled, and her final sprint to the finish line was executed with the precision of someone who had never doubted the outcome. Stevens finally managed to flip his tire a second time, then a third, each repetition taking longer than the last as his body continued to fail him. His fellow trainees wanted to cheer him on, but the atmosphere was too tense, too charged with the weight of lessons being learned and hierarchies being established. When Stevens finally reached the rope climb, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the rope. His first attempt to climb resulted in him sliding back down after only a few feet, his grip strength completely gone. The second attempt was even worse, and by the third try, it was clear that he wasn't going to be able to complete the obstacle under his own power. Captain Martinez had finished the course and was standing at the finish line, her breathing only slightly elevated despite having just completed one of the most challenging physical tests the military had to offer. She wasn't even sweating heavily, and her uniform looked like she had just finished a casual training run rather than a grueling obstacle course. The contrast between her condition and Stevens was stark and undeniable. While she stood calmly at the finish line, Stevens was still struggling with an obstacle that she had completed with ease. The gap between them wasn't just physical, it was professional, mental, and spiritual. She operated on a level that he couldn't even comprehend, let alone match. Finally, one of the other instructors approached Stevens and quietly suggested that he had proven his point and could come down from the rope. The suggestion was phrased as an option, but everyone understood it was really an order disguised as mercy. Stephen's humiliation was complete, and prolonging it would serve no one. As Stephen slowly made his way to the finish line, his head hanging in shame and his body trembling with exhaustion, Captain Martinez watched him approach with an expression that was difficult to read. There was no triumph in her eyes, no satisfaction at having proven her point so decisively. If anything, she looked disappointed. Not in his performance, but in the circumstances that had made this demonstration necessary. The other trainees maintained their distance, unsure how to process what they had just witnessed. This wasn't just about Stephen's losing a race. It was about the shattering of assumptions and the brutal education that came with challenging authority, without understanding what that authority was built upon. Stevens finally reached the finish line, his face red with exertion and shame, his body language that of a man who had been thoroughly and completely defeated. He stood before Captain Martinez, unable to meet her eyes, waiting for the words that would determine his future in the program. Captain Martinez studied Stevens for a long moment, her expression unreadable as she considered the broken man standing before her. The silence stretched uncomfortably, broken only by Stevens's labored breathing and the distant sounds of other training exercises continuing around the base. "Look at me, Stevens." Her voice was quiet but carried absolute authority. Stevens reluctantly raised his eyes to meet hers, and what he saw there wasn't anger or satisfaction, but something far more disturbing. Disappointment, mixed with a cold assessment that suggested his military future was being calculated in real time. "What did you learn today?" she asked, her tone suggesting that his answer would determine whether this humiliation served any constructive purpose or was simply a waste of everyone's time. Stevens struggled to find words that wouldn't make his situation worse than it already was. His mouth opened and closed several times before he finally managed to speak, his voice hoarse from exertion and shame. "Ma'am, I learned that I made incorrect assumptions about your capabilities, and that my behavior was completely inappropriate for a military professional." The words came out in a rush, as if he was afraid he might lose the courage to say them if he spoke more slowly. Captain Martinez nodded slightly, but her expression didn't soften. "That's a start. But it's not enough. What you demonstrated today wasn't just disrespect for me personally, it was a fundamental failure to understand what leadership and authority mean in a military context." She gestured toward the obstacle course that had just destroyed his confidence so completely. "This course isn't about proving who's stronger or faster. It's about demonstrating the qualities that make someone capable of leading others in life or death situations. Judgment, preparation, technique, mental toughness, and the wisdom to know your own limitations." Stevens nodded miserably, beginning to understand that his failure went much deeper than simply losing a physical competition. He had revealed character flaws that called into question his suitability for the elite forces he was hoping to join. "You assumed that physical size and gender determined capability," Captain Martinez continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a professional evaluation rather than a personal rebuke. "In doing so, you demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking that gets people killed in combat situations." The assembled trainees listened intently, understanding that they were receiving a masterclass in leadership and accountability. This wasn't just Stevens' education. It was theirs as well. In special operations, you might find yourself following orders from a female intelligence officer, taking tactical advice from a smaller teammate, or depending on someone who doesn't fit your preconceived notions of what a warrior should look like. If you can't respect authority and expertise regardless of the package it comes in, you're not just useless, you're dangerous. Stevens felt the full weight of her words settling on his shoulders like another heavy pack that he would have to carry for the rest of his military career. This wasn't just about one embarrassing afternoon. This was about fundamental flaws in his character that would need to be completely rebuilt if he wanted to continue serving. Captain Martinez pulled a small notebook from her pocket and made several quick notations. Stevens watched her writing with growing dread, knowing that whatever she was recording would follow him through the rest of his time in the program and possibly beyond. "You will report to me every morning at 0500 for individual remedial training," she announced, closing the notebook with a sharp snap. "We're going to work on your physical conditioning, your attitude, and your understanding of what it means to be part of a team where everyone's life depends on everyone else's competence and character. The punishment was harsh but not career-ending, and Stevens felt a small surge of relief that he wasn't being immediately dismissed from the program. But Captain Martinez wasn't finished with him yet. Furthermore, you will research and prepare a presentation on the history of women in combat roles, focusing specifically on examples of female service members who have demonstrated exceptional courage and leadership under fire. You'll deliver this presentation to your entire class, and it better be thorough, accurate, and respectful. Stevens nodded quickly, grateful for any opportunity to demonstrate that he could learn from his mistakes and grow as a professional and a person. The assignment was clearly designed to force him to confront his own prejudices through education and research. Finally, Captain Martinez said, her voice taking on a tone that made everyone within hearing distance pay closer attention. You will apologize to every member of your training class for the unprofessional behavior they witnessed today. Not because you lost a competition, but because you demonstrated attitudes and behaviors that have no place in military service. The requirement to apologize publicly was perhaps more painful than the physical beating he had just received. It meant acknowledging his failures not just to Captain Martinez, but to all of his peers, who would have to decide whether they could trust him to have their backs in dangerous situations. Captain Martinez stepped closer to Stevens, her voice dropping to a level that only he could hear. This is your one chance to prove that today was an aberration, rather than a reflection of your true character. I suggest you make the most of it, because there won't be a second opportunity to make this right. Stevens straightened his shoulders as much as his exhausted condition would allow, and managed to meet her eyes directly. Yes, ma'am. I understand completely, and I won't let you down again. Don't worry about letting me down, Captain Martinez replied, with a slight smile that held no warmth whatsoever. Worry about letting down the teammates who might depend on you someday. 6 months later, Stevens stood before his graduating class in dress uniform. His posture perfect, and his eyes reflecting a maturity that hadn't been there on that humiliating day when he had challenged Captain Martinez. The transformation had been neither quick nor easy, but it had been complete. The daily 0500 sessions with Captain Martinez had initially been torture, both physical and mental. She had pushed him harder than any instructor he had ever encountered. But more importantly, she had forced him to examine and rebuild his fundamental assumptions about strength, leadership, and respect. Those early morning sessions had become the foundation of a new understanding about what it truly meant to be part of an elite military unit. His presentation on women in combat had been a revelation, not just for his classmates, but for Stevens himself. The research had introduced him to stories of courage and sacrifice that shattered every stereotype he had carried about female service members. He learned about pilots who had flown impossible missions, medics who had saved lives under fire, and intelligence officers who had gathered crucial information behind enemy lines. The most powerful part of his presentation had been his account of Captain Martinez's own service record, which he had been given permission to share with the class. Her Bronze Star had been awarded for leading a rescue mission that saved 12 wounded soldiers from an overrun outpost in Afghanistan. She had personally carried 2 severely injured men to safety while under direct enemy fire, then returned to coordinate the evacuation of the remaining wounded. Her Purple Heart had come from the same mission, when shrapnel from a mortar round had torn through her left shoulder. Instead of accepting evacuation herself, she had continued to direct the rescue operation until every other casualty had been safely extracted. The attending physician's report, which Stevens had been allowed to read during his research, described her as the most focused and professional soldier I have ever treated under combat conditions. Stevens had delivered this information to his classmates with genuine respect and admiration, and the transformation in his attitude had been obvious to everyone present. The man who had once questioned Captain Martinez's authority based on her gender was now speaking about her achievements with the kind of reverence usually reserved for military legends. The formal apology he had made to his class had been equally powerful, but for different reasons. Stevens had been completely honest about his failures, acknowledging not just his disrespectful behavior but the underlying attitudes that had driven it. He had asked for their forgiveness and their patience as he worked to become the kind of teammate they deserved. Most importantly, he had acknowledged that his behavior had potentially put all of them at risk by undermining unit cohesion and respect for authority. In special operations, such breakdowns in discipline could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure, between coming home alive and being carried home in flag-draped coffins. Now, as graduation approached, Stevens had earned back the respect of his classmates and instructors through consistent demonstration of the values he had learned through his humiliation and subsequent education. Captain Martinez had become not just his commanding officer, but a mentor whose example had shaped his understanding of what true strength and leadership looked like. The final irony was that Stevens had actually become one of Captain Martinez's most successful trainees. His transformation had been so complete and his new understanding so deep that other instructors had begun using his case as an example of how proper mentorship could turn even the most problematic attitudes into strengths. Captain Martinez herself had watched Stevens's evolution with professional satisfaction, but she had never allowed their relationship to become anything other than strictly professional. She had given him the tools to rebuild himself, but the actual work had been his responsibility, and he had risen to the challenge in ways that exceeded even her expectations. On graduation day, as Stevens received his SEAL pin and the right to wear the coveted Naval Special Warfare insignia, Captain Martinez was present in the audience. When their eyes met across the ceremony, there was a moment of mutual acknowledgement, not of forgiveness, because none had been requested or required, but of growth, learning, and the successful completion of a lesson that had changed both teacher and student. Stevens would go on to serve with distinction in multiple deployments, earning commendations for his leadership and his ability to work effectively with diverse teams. He would eventually become an instructor himself, and his first lesson to new trainees would always be about respect, assumptions, and the dangerous consequences of both arrogance and ignorance. The story of his confrontation with Captain Martinez became a legend within the SEAL community, but not for the reasons Stevens had once hoped. It became a cautionary tale about the importance of character over physical strength, wisdom over prejudice, and the transformative power of leaders who cared enough to break down destructive attitudes and rebuild them into something better. Years later, when Stevens was asked about the most important lesson of his military career, his answer was always the same: "I learned that true strength has nothing to do with size or gender, and everything to do with character, preparation, and the courage to admit when you're wrong and work to become better." Captain Martinez continued to serve with distinction, eventually rising to command positions where her example inspired countless other service members to challenge their own assumptions and strive for excellence regardless of the obstacles they faced. The shadow she had cast over Stevens that day had ultimately become a shelter under which he had learned to grow into the warrior and leader he was meant to become.